The A7V is probably the most unusual tank you'll see. And this isn't the real thing, this is a replica. There's only one real one left, and that's in Australia. It's a bit of a long way to go just to see a tank. But it's an interesting tank all the same. Although the Germans only built 20 of them, it was built as a lesson, really, in tank construction, following our early attempts to show them a tank in the 15th of September 1916. They thought they could do better, and in some respects they did. But being perhaps German, they wanted a thing that was far more practical, a sprung vehicle that was far more practical on the battlefront than ours. The trouble was, what they forgot about was the fact that you need all-round tracks like the British tanks had to get over the rougher ground. And failing that, they really built a tank that was disastrous. If it hit anything like uneven ground, it had a nasty habit of falling over. And you spent a lot of time looking at the underside of it for that reason. The actual tank is built like a box, and it's built on tracks which are in fact the Holt Caterpillar tracks. They lengthened them by about 3 units because they wanted a sprung track. And the 3 units are articulated, so it would go over rough ground. But because the front and the back overhung the tracks, it tended to bury its nose in if it got anywhere else. Now, the armour was also better than on a British tank. They had 30mm thick armour at the front and 15 or 20mm at the side. So they were pretty well bulletproof, but still it was a waste of time with the tank so heavy and liable to fall over at a moment's notice. They were armed with a 6-pounder gun. It's the Belgian version of the British 6-pounder. And in fact, it's so similar that apart from the fact that it had a slower rate of fire than the British gun, it was as effective, and it had the advantage that the gun was pointing in the direction the tank was moving, which is a good thing in a way. The drawback was they say the British tanks with guns sticking out the side were a waste of time. But at least it meant the British tanks had 2 guns, and sometimes you could fire from the side at an approaching tank. And that's what they did on the first tank versus tank action, when a British Mark IV male encountered a German A7V near the town of Villebretonneau in France. And the German tank approached the British tank firing its gun. And the British tank turned left and went along very slowly and stopped. And that was the secret. By stopping, he avoided the vibration that was normally set up when a tank was going along, took careful aim and put 3 rounds through this thing, so much so that the crew abandoned it. Now, the crew of one of these things was staggering. In a British tank, you had a crew of 8, if you include the officer who was commanding the tank. The Germans had a crew of 18. There was a cannoneer and a loader for the main gun at the front. There were 2, a loader and a machine gunner for 6 machine guns, 2 at each side and 2 more sticking out the back. And 2 more men sitting up the top there in that cab, and they're the driver and the officer in charge, and a couple of mechanics who were supposed to keep the engines running. Where they went at the rest of the time, I don't know. But that's 18 men. Now, they say that the Germans sometimes put 22 people in here. Whether they were all members of the crew or had a duty, or whether they were just passengers in there to learn the secrets of tank operating, I don't know. But they reckon that if you knock one of these things out, and if the crew got out alive, which they invariably did, you had all them to reckon with before you'd subdued the tank properly, and that was quite difficult. It had 2 Daimler 4-cylinder 100 horsepower engines. They were located side by side in the middle. The reason for that was that the tank travelled in either direction. You had 2 engines driving into a combined 3-speed gearbox, and the gearbox was so arranged that you could change it over so that it could go in either direction. You didn't have a reverse gear as such. You used 3 speeds forward, switch it over and use 3 speeds going the other way. So in fact the tank was double-ended. It never seemed to do that. You always regarded the end of the cannon in as the front for obvious reasons, but that's how it worked. And the gearbox is an incredible thing. Fitted between the frames, it was in a huge casting, quite low down, and it kept the weight fairly low. But even then, the trouble with this tank is that it was a bit on the top heavy side. And if it encountered a hole in the ground or a trench or something like that, it invariably fell in it and usually fell over. At which point, of course, the tank's absolutely useless. But it's got these things here, these devices, they cover towing hooks to get it out of trouble. You lift them up and there's a towing hook underneath, and you hitch up the tank and tow it away, if no one's shooting at you, that is. Plus you've got a sheet of metal down there to protect its underside to some extent, because the underside is pretty well exposed, and if you've got a shot in there, you'd write the tank off pretty quickly, and that may have made quite a difference. But it's quite an effective vehicle in that respect, apart from this unfortunate habit of falling over. Now, if you can see down this side, there are two machine gun positions, one here and one further back, and they would be the same on the other side, and there'd be two more sticking out the back of the tank. So it had 6 machine guns altogether. They were the 08 pattern Maxim, which is the big water-cooled Maxim, and they each had 2 men, a gunner and a chap to feed in the bullets. And they were down both sides, but of course you couldn't bring them all to bear on the enemy at once, which rather restricted their firepower. You could use the cannon against the tank, and you could use whichever machine guns were pointing or could be pointed at it. But apart from that, you couldn't use them all, because some of them were pointing at your own troops out the back, which is not a terribly good idea. At the top you've got ventilation for the guns, and you need that because when those guns are firing, the amount of fumes built up inside becomes very oppressive. And with 22 men in there, everyone coughing their guts up, you need to clear the air as quickly as possible. So you've got 2 men inside sitting above the engine. Now they sit in reversible chairs that swing around. And the idea is that they can turn around and face the other way at a moment's notice and drive that way, which certainly makes a difference as far as they're concerned. But so, you know, what you call the front and the back is really academic, since it can go in either direction perfectly. But it does make more sense to say that the gun is at the front. The Germans reckon they built a far superior tank to the British, which in technical terms they had. In practical terms, of course, they built tanks that weren't suitable for the Western Front. That's the biggest problem with them. If they wouldn't survive on the Western Front, they couldn't survive anywhere. The Germans had a number of tanks which they captured off the British, but they didn't use them as adventurously as you'd like to think they would. It's quite weird, really, with the Germans taking the lead in their panzer armies of 1939-40, being so behind with them in 1918 that they caught up very quickly, with a bit of an interregnum in the middle, and they weren't allowed any tanks at all. But it makes quite an interesting vehicle. It's probably one of the most amazing tanks you'll ever see. As I said, this one's a replica. It doesn't have the driver's seat above the engine. In fact, the engine's a different one anyway, and you have a chap sitting at the back who drives it. And he has a television screen and a camera looking at the front to give him some idea where he's going. So if you see it coming, keep out the way, won't you? But that's it, the A7V.